Hello and welcome everyone to today's IFSEC Connect Strat Talk webinar, where we'll be discussing the future of video surveillance in the security industry, looking at current trends, challenges, and future opportunities in the sector. Thank you to ONVIF for sponsoring today's discussion. I'm James Moore, editor of IFSEC Global, and I'll be introducing and moderating today. Just a few things to note before we get started. This webinar is designed to be interactive, so please do ask any questions you have and would like answered by panelists in the Q&A box on the top right of your screen. We've got several items for discussion already on the agenda for the early stages, but we have plenty of time left towards the end of the session for audience questions. Please do keep these relevant to the subject matter at hand and make it clear if the question is directed at a specific panelist, just so I know who to ask. Questions will not be made public, but will be fed through to me separately, so don't be alarmed if you can't see anything coming through on the viewing platform itself. For a bit of context, much of the discussion will revolve around questions and themes that came out of a survey IFSEC undertook earlier this year, where we received feedback from several key vendors in the sector on where they saw the industry heading, why, and what this may mean to professionals. The answers have been summarized in an exclusive ebook, which is available for download for free as part of joining this webinar, which you should be able to find in the window somewhere. Please be sure to open this in a new tab if you wanted to take a look during the discussion, just so you aren't directed away from the webinar screen itself. Lastly, if you're experiencing any technical problems, please type any issues into the need help chat box, and one of the technical team will be on hand to support you. And if you'd like to watch the webinar back or you have any internet issues during the session, don't worry, this is being recorded and will be available to watch back on demand throughout June. So feel free to log back on any time, catch up between meetings on the platform and just watch at your leisure. As mentioned, today's discussion points have been formulated from responses we received to a survey from vendors sent earlier this year. There were some clear themes that came out of this, alongside potential trends, opportunities and challenges coming up for the surveillance sector. So what came out of the survey? Well, to briefly summarize and provide some context, the use of AI and deep learning algorithms for video analytics continues to grow. And though providing clear benefits for security, such as the reduction of false alarms, improving response times, it has also encouraged additional stakeholder involvement with surveillance procurement. The use of cloud-based systems is also being highlighted, such as for storage purposes, and integration of surveillance devices with other parts of the security spectrum is perceived to be a key trend in the coming years. There is also, however, rising concern over cybersecurity practices, as more and more devices are IP-based and connected to organizational or home networks, while questions remain over the use of tech such as facial recognition systems, particularly with regards to privacy and data protection. So what do all these changes mean for the industry? How are end users affected compared to installers and integrators, for instance? Well, we'll attempt to take a look at that over the next 50 minutes or so. I am delighted to be joined by today's panel, each of whom can provide their own unique thoughts and expert insights into the issues at hand. You can find out a little bit more about their job roles in the bios on the left of your screen, but I'm just going to allow each of them to introduce themselves and then we'll get going. First up, we have Professor Fraser Sampson, the UK's Biometrics and Surveillance Camera Commissioner at the Home Office. Hi, Fraser, do you want to give us a short intro into your role?
Yes, hi, thanks very much again for the invitation on here. Hello to my fellow panelists and to audience members who are dialing in and viewing this. Very briefly, yeah, I was appointed in March to cover two roles. The first is that of the Biometrics Commissioner for the UK, and I'm responsible for looking at the use and retention of DNA and fingerprints throughout the UK in various settings, including national security determinations. And the second one, which is more directly relevant to this setting today, is to take over from Tony Porter, with whom you'll be very familiar, as the Surveillance Camera Commissioner, with responsibility for overseeing and advising on and encouraging the use of the statutory surveillance camera code and of continuing Tony's work really with the national surveillance camera strategy.
Perfect, thank you, Fraser. Next, we have Alex Carmichael, Chief Executive at the SSAIB. Hi, Alex, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit more?
Good afternoon, all. I'm Alex Carmichael, the Chief Executive of SSAIB. I've been involved in the surveillance camera world really from 2012, when the then forensic scientific regulator, Andrew Redison, was appointed the first surveillance camera commissioner, and I was appointed as the strand lead for the standard strand, and I've been involved in surveillance world since then. As the chief executive of SSAIB, of course, I have CCTV and surveillance camera installers as registered firms, and it's an interesting time to be in the CCTV stroke surveillance camera world.
Absolutely, it certainly is. And we have Oliver Philippou, Research Manager for Physical Security Technologies at Omdia. Oliver, do you want to tell us a little bit more about your analyst role?
Yes, hello, Oliver Philippou. So I lead the Omdia research branch for the security technologies business. I have a team of analysts all over the world reviewing key trends and market sizes and forecast expectations for all elements of the physical security industry, from video surveillance to access control to intruder alarms to cloud and VSAS. I have a particular focus on analytics and video surveillance personally.
Perfect. And next, Ben Linklater, who, as well as his role as Commercial Director at Optex, is also the Chairman of the Video Surveillance Systems Group at the British Security Industry Association, or BSIA for short. Hi, Ben. Feel free to say a little bit more about your role.
Yes, thanks for the invite today. Great to meet all the panelists and our viewers. Yeah, I'm the chair of the VSS section of the BSIA. We do a lot of work around video surveillance and upcoming trends, future trends, lobbying, government, etc. I'm trying to understand and be the voice of the industry, really. I'm speaking on behalf of the various installers and people in the industry.
Perfect. And finally, last but not least, we have Leo Levit, who was recently appointed chairman of the steering committee at ONVIF. Leo, for those who don't know much about ONVIF, do you want to give a short introduction and tell us a little bit more about your own role?
Yeah, absolutely. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining. As you might know, ONVIF is an industry forum that has as a mission to promote and provide standard interfaces for effective interoperability of IP-based physical security devices and systems and products. So, as you just said, I am newly appointed chairman of the steering committee, so overseeing the work and trying to help our member companies to work with the standardization of IP-based security devices and interfaces. And also have another role as well as for many of industry specific forums. I'm coming from one of the member companies. I'm coming from Axis Communications, and holding a position as Director of System Integration. So really speaks to the heart of the mission of ONVIF.
Absolutely. Thank you very much all for joining us today. I think to kickstart the discussion, it's worth talking about some of the key trends that the industry is witnessing. There are several to choose from, but I thought we'd start with how AI, or as others call it, deep learning, has developed and why it's playing an increasingly important role for security professionals. Leo, I think if I come to you first, I'm wondering what your perspective is on the role of AI and analytics. How do you think it's changed over the years? And would you agree that it's becoming increasingly utilized?
I definitely agree to that statement, and it's becoming extremely important, and technology as such maturing more and more, and AI been a topic for the technology discussions for decades now. But what I think happens now with this trend is a maturity of technology reach a certain level at the same time as capabilities of the devices and systems where this technology can run also evolve. So that includes edge devices, cameras, or other security devices based in the networks, but also maturity of other parts of the technologies such as cloud technologies evolves. And that gives a possibility for application developers to really drive the development of use cases that serves the purpose of the security industry. So yeah, I would definitely agree that AI is growing and that's boosting the analytics possibilities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know, Ben, if you've seen a kind of growing use of analytics during COVID because of all the different things that they can do on the cameras now, occupancy monitoring, that kind of thing. Is that something you've noticed from your side?
Yeah, it's been quite interesting. We speak of AI. I mean, I believe AI was actually one of the first programs that detected coronavirus right in the beginning, before the WHO announced the pandemic. It was AI that actually detected that the pandemic was on its way, by tracking location, infection, spread, and so forth, and actually forecast or predicted the pandemic long before any of us did, which is quite interesting. But more to your question, yeah, I mean, we've seen for a long time analytics used in footfall, etc., tracking, heat mapping shops or airports, etc. And what we found is a lot of people repurpose this pretty quickly to be able to look at occupancy in buildings to ensure that we're not getting too many people into a building at a time. We've obviously seen, we've all been to the shops and we've seen the various people sitting there counting 1-2 people in, but this is very labor intensive. And all you need is a security officer or a staff member to be distracted, clicking their buttons, and suddenly you have too many people inside. So various AIs have proven invaluable to be able to monitor and ensure we have the right amount of people in a shop, given the right amount of spacing between people, going as far as thermal cameras on AI, on analytics to detect different temperatures on skins and give us pre-warning. So we're seeing a lot of this evolving, and in actual fact, we see it growing. It's going to become a big trend as we move forward. I think we'll see a lot more of this being rolled out for future proofing. What happens if another pandemic comes along? Are we ready for that? How do we avoid a complete shutdown in the future? I think analytics and AI will play a vital role in this part.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that I've noticed as well. Getting a lot of kind of releases in about different analytic solutions being able to track this kind of thing. Fraser, I'm wondering from your perspective, what your view is on whether you've had any concerns from citizens about the use of it and things like track and trace and things like that. Is there any concerns over privacy with all this stuff?
Sorry, James. Yes, I'm laughing because as I said in my introduction, I came into this role in March and I've received a great deal of correspondence ever since. But the inbox has been dominated by only 3 letters, and those letters are AFR. And so I think for me that one technological application such as this can foreshadow every interview, presentation, and conversation, is indicative to me, at least, of how carefully and comprehensively we need to approach the future of surveillance and biometrics, because it's, of course, where they tend to cross over. And it's fair to say that, yes, there is, on the one hand, there's significant expression of public concern about some of the technology, but at the same time, there seems to be a more muted response from the other side. So I've made it clear in a number of public interviews when asked, do you think that the police, and it's in the context of policing that I've generally been approached by this, do you think the police should use or be allowed to use facial recognition technology? And my view is, that they've no alternative but to use facial recognition technology and any other technology that gives them new tools and techniques that will help them discharge their functions reasonably and accountably and proportionally.
Absolutely. We have got a couple of questions on AFR shortly coming up, so I'll probably be coming back to you quite quickly. But in terms of how analytics and AI and deep learning applications have grown, Alex, since your tenure began at the SSAIB, I think it was 2015, if I'm right in thinking. But obviously, you mentioned you've been involved in it since 2012. How have you seen the industry develop in terms of the tech? And obviously, vendors are quick to point out the significant advances, but are installers and integrators that the SSAIB certifies on top of this kind of tech? Or is there like an education piece necessary here, do you think?
Oh, yeah, education definitely needs to be there. I think for the installers themselves, it depends which installers you're talking about, because depending on what your contracts are and who you're working with, will depend on how much you get involved in AI. Some of the small installers probably haven't touched it at all, but the medium to larger size, definitely. Because the customers, when the new products come on the market and the customers find out about it, of course, they want the new shiny thing which has appeared. This sounds great, let's implement it, let's put it in our systems. And 9 times out of 10, installers can be caught short when they suddenly find the customers asking for something which they may not know about. The manufacturers are very good. They make equipment which they design and they think this is a good idea, let's sell it into the marketplace. But is there a market for it? So installers come along, they find out there's new kit, they then pass it on to the customers, or the other way around, the customers turn around and say, we've heard about this suits our goal, this is what we want to do, can you install it? And the installer's sitting there scratching his head going, yeah, of course I can do this. So yeah, education is very important here. And manufacturers, I think, have a responsibility to educate the installer base about their new products and what they do. They do a great job. They come to shows like IFSEC and they see new products and they can be shown how it works and they can then have training on it. But I think there is more education needed, especially when it comes to AI, because I think there is a gap between what is capable and what people can do, i.e. what the installer can do, what the integrator can do. And I think education is key to this going forward. Also, one of the other problems, of course, is technology moves faster than the installer base can catch up with, that the education base can catch up with. And the customers always see things on TV, which they believe, hey, that sounds good, I can use that in this application. And of course, what's shown on TV isn't actually available. So I think there's a massive education piece coming up here from our installers. Yes, AI is moving in. We've had cases where AI is being used and analytics is being used in proper cases, if you know what I mean. It's been thought about, the issues to do with human rights and the privacy has been thought about. But I'm quite sure out there in the world and in the installer base, there are other cases where installers probably are not using it in the proper way, not because they don't know how to use it or they know how to install it, but because the customers asked for it and they've put it in. There are standards, of course, out there. We talked about facial recognition. There are standards for facial recognition of how to install a facial recognition system, the 30137 series. So there's a lot of work going on, but I think in AI, we are just at the start of it. And we've got a long way to go before it becomes commonplace and everybody understands it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a key point of understanding it, not just sort of seeing it and thinking, it's going to be useful across the board. There needs to be kind of specific applications where it's good for. Oliver, from an analyst point of view, what do you think the key reasons are for analytics now being seen as more value to the security industry, perhaps more so than before anyway?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would agree with your statement that they are definitely being seen as more value. And I think it's interesting, a lot of the comments that have already been said by the panel are something that resonate quite clearly with what the feedback we've been given as well. And particularly the Hollywood expectation that Alex was just mentioning. But in terms of the key reasons for the actual technology development itself, I mean, depending how you want to look at it, you can go back early, 2015, 2016 sort of time, and you kind of had this explosion of big data in order to produce the training data necessary for producing analytics. You had computational power from GPU development, which is one of another element which I'll get onto in a second, about driving the processing power required for these sorts of analytics. And you had the understanding, you had the computer scientists and the data scientists able to build the models and the underlying SDKs in order to make these sorts of
analytics possible. And that's kind of what led the explosion in terms of a technology point of view. But what that essentially led to was being able to take unstructured video and pull insight and information from it. So you're taking something that is, all this video, all these hundreds of millions of cameras around the world, producing all of this data, you're now able to produce some form of insight and understanding of what's actually happening in the scene. And I think that's the fundamentals of it. It's just better information around what's happening in your store, office, location.
Yeah, and you mentioned, people are able to sort of understand better what's going on. Are you hearing that there are now more kind of organizational stakeholders involved in the process? So it's not just security anymore, but security, the silos are being broken down, if you like.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's not just a case of it's a security budget that enables these sorts of analytics to tap into. It's now operations, it's security, it's IT as well, seeing as the industry has moved to a video surveillance industry. So yes, there are other budget holders, stakeholders involved in purchasing and usage of the, as I said, the information that's generated by it. I think on the other hand here, so that's from the end user pull scenario, if you like. You also have the manufacturer end, and you now don't just have, I don't want to be, small, you don't have small independent software developers anymore. These are now the NVIDIAs and Intels who are driving this sort of technology and really pushing it into the mainstream, which is why I think the end users are having a better understanding of it. And again, back to Alex's point of why you're probably hearing requests for these sorts of information to the installers.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly something we picked up on the ebook is that all the vendors are sort of promoting the fact that there is real sort of takeaways you can take from AI and deep learning applications now. So obviously the panel certainly agrees with this. Getting back to actually facial recognition, one technology that has become quite controversial in recent years is that of AFR. Fraser, obviously a large part of the surveillance camera commissioner role has been focused on the use of automated facial recognition, or AFR, in public spaces over recent years. Why do you think this has been, and what is your view on the matter, kind of leading, sort of going forwards, I guess?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question in terms of why this, compared to many other things that may have attracted the same attention and generated the same concern in the past. I'm not sure we'll ever know, but I think the only thing that moves faster, or seems to move faster than the technology, is the word of mouth about it. And it goes back to the points that we just made about the people's perception, whether it's through social media, whether it's through news feeds, more formally, or through Hollywood and Netflix. I think some of that is driving it, but I think this, for the first time, we're seeing a situation whereby by the time the technology is ready to be rolled out on any sort of larger scale in the public sector, that the bad news may have got there ahead of it, and people won't let it, or they've already formed a view about it. And I think that's a very real challenge, and it's something that does feel quite new. So I don't think it's just arisen from specific well publicized cases, but I think that's quite a new feature for me. Then there have been the very specific cases, the litigation in South Wales, which again I looked at as a lawyer before I came into this role, and it struck me that was by and large a data protection case about data protection principles occurring in the context of a surveillance camera setting. But it has become a surveillance camera case, if you like, that is often spoken about in that setting. But really, most of the issues, aside from the public sector equality duty in that case, were in fact broader issues of data protection. So issues such as awareness about retention periods, about how you make it onto a particular watch list, about where the equipment, in this case it was a camera system, can be deployed. But by and large, those are more around data protection than necessarily specifically camera-specific questions. And I think one of the other issues from that is that it has the potential to detract from other areas of legitimate concern around this, which would be non-data protection specific, such as chilling effects of people believing or even thinking that they are being listened to or surveilled in public spaces, and the impact that has on their readiness to hold a vigil or hold a candle or hold an opinion in public. And those are nothing to do with data protection, but they're very real concerns. And I think one of the other very new things about this is that we are rapidly moving from a position where policing has been seen as the exception that needs to be trusted with intrusive tactics because of the nature of their work, to policing now being seen as the exception that mustn't be permitted to use certain types of intrusive technology because of the nature of their work. And I think if that scenario is to continue, well, that isn't about the technology, that's about your relationship with policing more broadly.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've actually had a quite interesting question come in. Thank you to whoever sent this in. It's more on maybe the sort of private security side, but probably another one for you, Fraser. Given the furore over the use of AFR by the police during the Champions League, what is the likelihood of its adoption across the UK? I guess that's one case and builds a bigger picture, but have you got any kind of thoughts about that?
I mean, in terms of any specific instances, I wouldn't know and wouldn't have any information in relation to that. I think that facial recognition is one tactical option that is available to the police in the same way that using drones or National Police Air Service would be, or any other form of tool or technique which is assisted by prevailing technology. The key issues will be around the extent to which the policies under which those tactical options are mature and are accessible to people that are going to be subject to them, and allow for update and review in light of how they worked and complaints and so forth. So much in the way that the surveillance camera code addresses many of those areas for relevant bodies that are using them. But it is another tactical option that I think if you are a police commander making decisions around these type of things every day and every night, then you need to be able to explain as convincingly and as accountably why you've chosen not to use an available tool or technique as your reasons for having chosen to. So that I think is on you as the person making that decision, rather than people saying you ought not to be allowed to use this because it's insufficiently clear or it's too new to market or whatever. Those are legitimate concerns, but ultimately all our blue light service decision makers make these discretionary decisions all day and all night, and I'm glad they do. The key for me is that they are able to explain why they chose to, or as I said, why they've chosen not to.
Absolutely. Ben, I'm aware as part of your role in the BSIA, you worked on a best practice guide for security businesses when implementing facial recognition tech in their surveillance systems. Could you tell us a little bit more about this guide and what its purpose was?
I suppose the unmute button would be a good idea. Yes. Well, as Alex mentioned to earlier, the technical piece has been done on AFR, understanding how it works, how to apply it, the actual installation practices, etc. But what we looked at it was from a user's perspective. We know how to install it perhaps, but how do you know the ethics behind it? So AI or AFR, it's exponentially growing in our market, and we need to ensure that stakeholders are aware of the ethical and legal considerations when using these. If not, we see sort of cases where people start mistrusting the technology, leading to loss of trust and skepticism around it, and eventually we could end up with outright bans of the technology. And this technology, when used properly and ethically, can be very useful. To be slightly controversial, I suppose, if if you're using an AFR technology as an example at a concert, and you can identify a watch list suspect that could potentially cause harm to the various people at this concert. Is there a good use case there? It's a good question. And if the public has a better understanding of how it's used, not the Hollywood understanding where, everything's just captured and dated, and we're all, we are all suddenly this digital version of us that's being tracked every step, that's Hollywood. That's not the real use case. And when we start looking at the real use case and the real benefits, when applied ethically within a principled framework, we can use this technology pretty well. And understanding two various use cases is what we really drilled down to, being verification or identification. And these two pieces play quite differently into the public and the private sector. And then just understanding how we can use that, how that, considerations such as GDPR and all these other pieces and how that fits together. And it was just a basic guidance, because it is such a hot topic for both end users, installers, the general, anybody interested in this segment. It's just guidance for them to understand how we can use this and how to use it ethically and to develop trust in the technology as opposed to a complete mistrust.
Yeah, I think trust is probably the key word there, and it's definitely a technology that can be of use. It's just making sure that everybody is aware of how it's being used and proportionally.
It's exactly that. I mean, the technology. Let's face it, the technology can be misused and has been misused, and it's important. It's very important. I think Fraser was pointing out that AFR is very much in his inbox, and I assume 80% of that is negative. And it's because the bad news is always at the front, and people are concerned about their privacy, and rightly so. We should be concerned, and both voices need to be heard to strike a balance. And this is, I think, where we started our guidance from is how do we help that balance?
Absolutely.
Isn't one of the other issues here is Fraser's dealing with the public space, i.e., what the police and the councils can do, where Ben is looking at the private space, looking what your shops, your commercial, your retailers can do, and it's given them guidance as well of things to think about, the ethical and legal use of it and what you should be doing. And I think that's quite strong, and that's why I think the guide is, it's very good in that point, because the surveillance camera work is all about the public space and what the public authorities can do. The BSIA is looking at the private space and good guidance for the private space as well. So there's a good marry up there between them.
Completely agreed.
Yeah, absolutely. And totally agree, Alec. One thing, there's a question just come in actually, not necessarily just about AFR, but just before we move on from the kind of AI deep learning thing altogether. I don't know if Leo, you want to take this one. Do you think the enhancements in technology in surveillance cameras since COVID will be a permanent fixture, such as the use of thermal detection, for example? Do you think that will continue afterward?
Not a problem fixture. It will not, just that measure will not fix all the issues, but it definitely can contribute. And I really like the discussion we're having now, that technology as such is not harmful in any way. It's the use of that and lack of understanding of how to use it, how to utilize that. In similar way, in pandemic situation, which is a tragical event for the human society, but it really boosts a number of use cases that the industry trying to address with analytics and AI to help to boost the measures that can prevent from further spread and limiting the spread of infection and so on. It's all about how you use the technology, how you develop your use cases and utilizing the capabilities rather than the technology itself. Because I think Fraser mentioned that the technology evolution is so far ahead of the people understanding and education of how to use it. And in case with the ongoing pandemic, of course, it can contribute for the greater good, but it's very important so we all understand how to use it, how it should be integrated between different devices and systems, and what access to the information it provides you. And one topic that you mentioned, James, is trust. I mean, the information that is available to the system now, and especially with the ongoing extraordinary measures during pandemic, the amount of information and the type of information available is very sensitive for the people, right? So the way how we deal with that information is becoming extremely important. Who you really trust to hold this information, and how those companies and organizations deal with that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. More questions coming in. This is brilliant, and we'll move on. There's a section on cybersecurity that I want to get to, but just one more question. Also, who's best placed to answer this? But I'll come to Alec first. But if anybody wants to jump in, let me know. How can we build trust on AFR when there is concerns over sort of racial or gender bias in the kind of data sets that it's being used on? Is there any kind of opinion on that? Obviously, it's something that's come out of findings in the last year or so.
Well, I think you're talking about the misuse of it, to be honest. You have to have a legitimate reason to use AFR, and that should be stated straight up and down. And any end user who wants AFR for a specific reason, and this is where the installer base and the integrator base have a responsibility as well. So if the AFR is going to be misused, then the installer and the integrator should understand that and should inform the customer. I don't think it's an easy answer to this one, but it's how you use AFR, how you use any AI or any analytics. There must be a legitimate use for it. And I think that's what this boils down to. Because if you're starting to use it for gender and race, why are you using it for gender and race? Do you have a specific reason for doing that? What are you trying to achieve? And if the answer is you want to segregate certain parts of the population, then the answer should be, sorry, that you can't do that, because you don't have a legitimate reason to do that in the first place.
Sure. Ben, did you want to jump in there at all, or?
Yeah, I think, Alex, you have a very good point. I think in this particular question, they're referring to innate inbuilt bias in the training or in the learning material that's given to the software. It's a very interesting question, and it's one that's come up quite a bit in various discussions. If you look at the guidance that the BSIA has put together, one of the core elements inside that is, we have to manage this exact problem. And if the application case is picking up bias, it needs to be reported back to the manufacturer so that they can address this very quickly. Now, is it true that there's historically bias in these softwares? Of course, it depends on the data sets fed into them and which type of AI we are using. If we really get into the nitty-gritties of the AI, the machine learning and the deep learning, it depends on the process. But keeping it sort of top level, nowadays the data sets are becoming very diverse. That they're feeding into the systems. And in actual fact, a lot of the data sets now don't even use actual people. It's generated, electronically generated faces of various ethnic minorities, various mixes, minorities, majorities, genders, races, all ethnic backgrounds. So the longer the technology exists and the more we see this technological movement forward, and the better, coming back to what Leo was saying, using the high power GPUs, etc., and processing power, we're very quickly seeing the eradication of this bias in the technology. Is it possible that it could still happen? Of course it's possible, but it's important that we have the checks in place and the balances to remove it when it comes to quickly address it. And that falls back down to the manufacturers and keeping the manufacturers involved in the whole process.
I think there's an interesting element here of education required as well, isn't there?
Indeed, yeah.
Especially, I think it's difficult to differentiate something like AFR from other applications of artificial intelligence. If you take an insurance premium on, a compare website, that doesn't have any human involvement. The AFR has an element of human involvement through the process before a decision or an action is taken. I think if it was specifically just left to a machine to stop a suspect, or if it was a completely automated, process, you're right, it becomes a significant problem. I think because there is that human element intertwined. Oh,
Oliver, I think you've just gone on mute accidentally.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm not in any aspect I'm saying it's not a problem, but I think there needs to be an understanding of the process and how it is handled and how the process is handled.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. It's something that came out of the report we did. In that there's, I think the EU are looking at some AI legislation, for example, and the vendors were pointing out that it's important to know that there is a human element of the use of AI or deep learning algorithms in the security sector. It's, the humans are still the ones making the decisions. They're just using technology to improve those decisions, which I think is an important aspect. I think we could talk about this all day. To be honest, there's so much on it, and obviously Fraser is well aware of that by the sounds of his inbox. But I just want to come on to the issue of cybersecurity. It was something that was pointed out by all the vendors, and it's being pointed out in the mainstream media as well. The cybersecurity of IP connected surveillance devices and other security systems is under increased scrutiny, I think, perhaps more so than ever with the kind of just general rise in cyber attacks. Alec, if I come to you first, do you think the industry is becoming more aware of this as a whole, and particularly the installers you're speaking to? Are they kind of worried about it, concerned about it, asking any particular questions?
Yeah, I think the industry is aware of it as a whole. It's been bubbling under now for quite a few years. It's not a new topic, but I think as more and more attacks happen, I think the industry has become more aware and also are looking at this because, of course, we moved from an analog systems now to a digital systems. And as more and more these digital systems are taking over from analog, I think the cyber side of it is something which more and more installers are getting to grips with. But everybody in the supply chain has a part to play. The manufacturers need to build kit, which is secure by default, which is the good work of the Surveillance Camera Commissioner, who put out the secure by default guide for manufacturers who've got together and got behind it. And there is a list of the equipment on the Commissioner's website, which is secure by default. So the manufacturers have their part to play. The consultants have their part to play to make sure that any system which is designed securely for cybersecurity. The installer, when installs it, makes sure that the equipment, when it is installed cyber secure, which is one part of it. The second part of it is the installers and integrators themselves making sure that their systems are cyber secure, either by Cyber Essentials or by 27001. So the industry, and I've been talking to installers out there, they are very well aware of that. But like all these things, it's making sure the supply chain all the way through is aware, and what's received can be fitted securely and is being defaulted securely in the beginning. So yes, the installers are aware of it.
Definitely, and the supply chain is again something that came out of the report. It was vendors highlighted that it was partly their responsibility, but partly installers, partly integrators, partly consultants, partly end users. It's everybody's responsibility to keep an eye on it together, I guess. Alec, you mentioned the secure by default certification scheme. Fraser, I don't know if you want to give us a little bit more information about that, particularly for those watching who maybe aren't based in the UK and aren't aware of it.
Yeah, sure. So I mentioned my predecessor, Tony Porter, at the introductory stage. One of the things that Tony introduced was a secure by default scheme, which I'm still coming up to speed on in terms of hard evidence of what that's produced, but it certainly produced some very clear guidance. There are products that are identified through the audit and self review process on there, but it's a good scheme which intuitively increases standards and at the same time reduces the opportunities for risk. So if there are sort of widespread, or there were widespread practices of sort of hard coding in passwords, for example, where they're all the same, that manufacturers use them for administrative processes, removing those as soon as possible, closing off some really obvious windows in the same way that, in the old world, you might have stopped your janitor using a 3-lever Morse key for all the doors to get in, just for sort of convenience and uniformity. So it's kind of the digital version of that as I see it, and I'm looking into how we can carry on pushing that forward, but also to spreading the concept of that wider. So there were a number of interesting quotes in the IFSEC survey responses. One of them that I noted was that no one wants to be responsible for the weakest link in an IT network, which of course is true. It's also true about surveillance camera systems more broadly. And I think through the Secure by Default scheme, we've identified and addressed some of the weakest links upstream. But I think weakness in this context can come from a number of variables. It can, yes, come from security, privacy, data protection, compliance, of course. And you can design in strengths and by default and design out opportunities for malfunction or malfeasance. But increasingly, I think those weaknesses can come in the form of much wider issues, such as the discussion we just had on ethics, such as corporate social responsibility track record of the manufacturer themselves, which also find their way into my inbox. Some are procurement issues, some are contract management issues, and I'll be looking at these. But overall, to go back to a key theme that we've had through this discussion, you must have trust and confidence, and that trust and confidence must apply to the whole ecosystem. So if you're able to introduce a weakness or risk at one point, that will create a potential weakness or risk for all. So I'm really keen to understand how well this has been received and got traction, but also how we can expand the philosophy of that to all areas of the value chain, if that makes sense, James.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, the chain kind of runs through that theme. And Ben, I'm aware the BSIA has released 2 cybersecurity codes of practice in the last year or so. Obviously, growing focus on this from your perspective. I know one was for installers, but obviously we've discussed that a little bit. There was a more recent one I'm aware for manufacturers, if I'm correct in thinking. How important do you obviously it's important from a vendor point of view as well. Why did the BSIA release this specifically for vendors?
Well, I think much like we've just discussed, secure by design was the original sort of hard security. Secure by default, we're talking about making sure everything hung on a network is secure. Now, of course, the cybersecurity product assurance group, SSAIB, mouthful for short, worked on this. It's a code of practice, a system providing confidence through the supply chain, promoting sort of secure connections of anything put onto the network. So in creating a secure solution with everything becoming very much IP driven, as we've just said, nobody wants to be the weakest link on that chain. Of course, we don't want to leave anything for the installers or the integrators. We need to make sure that they've got all their boxes ticked. And similarly, we used to see cameras coming out with everything's default code, and it relies on the installer to go in and change everything. And it's looking at these practices and making sure that we're creating best practices to ensure that the networks remain safe, because cybersecurity is an ever-growing threat, and we're seeing this convergence of cybersecurity and physical security very, very quickly. The two worlds are merging at a rapid pace, and we need to make sure that we bring in that entire manufacturing side up to speed with the IT side of the world. Because again, your security system is only as robust as the weakest link. And if someone can get into that system and compromise it via a network, then the system was useless to start with. So we need to make sure we're covering all parts of it. And I suppose that's pretty much where we've come from with that.
Yeah, absolutely. The converged side is something that we're looking at in IFSEC. Certainly, we have the Converged Security Centre every year. And Oliver, from your side, from the analyst side, when you're speaking to physical security professionals, are you seeing there's more of a convergence? There's a breaking down of silos between IT and physical teams. How important do you think that is going to be going forward?
Oh, absolutely. And it's only getting more important. I think the reality is it's because of the transition, and I know we have discussion points on cloud and integration potentially coming up if we have time, but it's a clear trend towards those elements, and with that you're seeing IT sectors or teams, departments becoming more increasingly involved within the video surveillance aspect. And I think you only have to look to recent examples of Verkada, for example, of the news headlines, which happened only a couple of months ago, there of how important and how realistic these sorts of threats are. So it's definitely a problem that is continuing. I think it's also interesting that so far on I mean, it's only been a very brief topic, but it's been specifically about the product itself and secure by design. I think there's also an element of human cyber security, if that's the right phrase. I mean, I've spoken to integrators and they've told me of stories of how they've been to sites and they've seen post-it notes with all the passwords written on next to the computer. It's just like, I think there needs to be some sort of understanding of what actually happens and the impact it potentially has.
Yeah, and I've seen that come under, almost the insider threat, not necessarily the insider threat as you perceive it initially, but there are several different insider threats, one of which is essentially negligence, I guess, and something that needs to be thought about as well. Obviously, you mentioned integration there, and we'll come on to that topic now. We also covered access control and intruder alarms in our research, and there are corresponding presentations going on over the next couple of days at IFSEC Connect for them. One thing that came out of all of them was integration between security devices and other building management systems kind of growing. For instance, cameras that link into access control, but also cameras that might link into fire alert systems and things like this. Leo, from an ONVIF point of view, obviously this is very important. What's your perspective on this, and how important do you think open protocols will be in the security industry as we go forward?
Well, open protocols are very important in the industry from the perspective of not locking in users to a specific vendor, but it also gives the integrators a flexibility to design the network and the system based on the actual user needs, not what's available within the specific vendor that as an offering. So open interfaces and open protocols are probably key to drive the integration further, and ONVIF obviously very active in this domain. Coming to the topic of building management and access control, this is one of the parts that ONVIF work very active with, and as you might know, we have a number of profiles that specifies how the access control devices and system are talking to each other, enabling this openness in the protocols in communication, such as profile C, profile A, and what we're announcing now as a release candidate, profile D. So those work together to create as a foundation for the open access control system. But also it allows you to connect those systems with other profiles from ONVIF to video surveillance system, and that's give you a comprehensive view of what's really going on site. Not only controlling the doors, but also seeing what's going on at the doors. I think it's gives a fantastic opportunity for the integrators and then user to cope with the challenges they have and cope with the use cases they have on hand.
Yeah, absolutely. Oliver, I know you mentioned this already, but is this certainly something you're seeing in your research, a greater demand for integration with other building systems? Or is there kind of a viewpoint that it's still only really impacting, high-end commercial buildings in London, almost like lighthouse projects, if you will? Where do you think it's going or currently is?
Yeah, so I think at the moment it's definitely that lighthouse project mentality. I think it's larger infrastructure project, larger projects, larger buildings, newer buildings, if you like. So there is an element of integration. It's definitely there and it definitely exists, but it's going to become increasingly important. And as Leo was mentioning, you have video and you have access. I think you can actually go further, and if you want to. I mean, whilst we were just commenting about the Hollywood effect, I'm now going to advocate it. You could also integrate things such as building sensors for temperature and light and try and, especially as the world moves towards a more sustainable, eco-friendly, or eco-conscious, should I say, mentality, these sorts of technologies are going to help drive smarter buildings. So that, yes, I think ultimately we're not quite there yet. It's a high-end product, if you like, but it will transition down.
For sure, yeah. And Alec, I know obviously the SSAIB also covers the fire sector. Are you seeing any questions from installer members about how they begin to integrate security and fire, or is that not something you've seen quite yet?
No, I think it's already there now, to be honest. I think you'll find that you have other security systems in a building, so if the fire alarm goes off, the other systems in the building can help you, give you intelligence or give you confirmation that's a fire. I mean, if you have CCTV there, you can use that as well. So if the fire alarm and the CCTV or the surveillance camera system, whichever, the type of surveillance you have, because you may be using thermal images. You may not just have the visual systems. So all this can be used by the monitoring center or whoever's monitoring it to look at the pictures or the information presented when the fire alarm goes off to give you more information and therefore make a better judgment on calling the fire brigades out. Because of course, what you want to do is cut the false alarms down so the fire alarms only go out there. So yes, it's happening now. And there are camera systems out there at the moment which can detect fire, and that's their job because they use the analytics in the camera system to look for specific things. And of course, with thermal imaging and other types of surveillance systems, it's a new world out there. And I think it's quite an exciting one, as the different types of surveillance systems, because when we talk about surveillance system, we normally talk about a normal camera or a visual camera. But of course, out of the visual spectrum, both below it and above it, you've got different wavelengths, and you can utilize them to look for different tracks, and then using analytics, you can come up with different solutions. So it's all intelligence. So yes, it's out there already, I believe. And the fire alarm installers out there, if there's a camera system there and they fitted it, then they use it for surveillance and for intelligence for fire.
Excellent. Yeah, no, that's good to see that crossover is continuing into the integration world. Fraser, I've seen you sort of nodding along. Is this something you're sort of seeing as well, or witnessing? Getting any questions on? Obviously, your role encompasses biometrics and surveillance.
So yes, thank you, Alex. Yeah, I was completely agreeing with all that. Probably from a number of perspectives. One, the very narrow one, which is, of course, it's still in its infancy, but the governance arrangements for policing and fire in, I think, at least 6 areas now are within the same elected individual. So you have elected police, fire, and crime commissioners. So say you have in North Yorkshire, for example. So the corporation sold the body that is buying the systems then, or integrating with them from the fire perspective, will also be the same body that is holding their local police to account. So there will inevitably be a degree of comparison and read across there in terms of what could be shared, particularly if it reduces harm, promote.
Oh, I think the you paused there for a second, Fraser. Sorry about that.
Yeah. And the second one is the new biometrics generally, as people talk about them. So whether that's gate or ambient temperature or whatever it may be, my sort of working hypothesis is that established surveillance camera system that we have may well become the most obvious and available and trusted portal through which those new biometrics can get into the bloodstream behind them, which is the key bit, which is all the various systems that will analyze and use them. And I think that we will be talking about surveillance camera systems in the future, but they actually do far more than that and probably do very little that we recognize as being an old sort of camera system in the way that, my daughter, who's 17 now, talks about dialing on her phone, and she has never seen a phone with a dial on it. I think we will have the same with cameras, but there will be a portal through which new biometrics get into the bloodstream to be analysed.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, we're running out of time very quickly. We've just got one more question that's actually coming from the audience, so we'll ask that and then we'll wrap up. But unfortunately, we're not going to get quite to the cloud here, but there is some more information on that on the ebook. I think we could probably have another hour's discussion on the cloud anyway. Just a last question here for Leo, actually, about the upcoming ONVIF Profile M. Can you just give us a very brief rundown of what it is and the real benefits from the integrator perspective?
Yeah, the Profile M is at the stage of release candidate, so it's just about to happen, and it specifies the way we transfer the metadata from the devices to the system. So we was talking about the analytics, and obviously analytics works on the data from the sensors. So this is how we try to help and standardize the way the data transferred, analytics data transferred from the sensors to the systems where it could be analyzed. And I think it makes life easier both for integrators, but also for analytics vendors, whoever it is, and in what environment they work, if they work in cloud or on server domain. That makes it easier to connect sensors with analytics systems.
Perfect. Thanks very much. Right, that is unfortunately all the time we've got. We've had some great questions come in. We've covered a lot, and there's plenty more to cover besides. But thank you to our speakers, Fraser, Ben, Leo, Oliver, and Alex, for your insight and expertise. I really think that was a fantastic discussion. Got a little bit carried away in some of it because it was so interesting. But if you'd like to know more about further trends and challenges for the surveillance sector, don't forget to download the free ebook available from this window. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, ONVIF. For those who'd like to know more about them, do visit their booth on the IFSEC Connect platform, have a browse, and even set up a meeting if you wish. And thank you to everyone in the audience for your questions, participation, and attention. Within the next 24 to 48 hours, today's discussion should be available to watch back on demand on this platform. Please feel free to invite any colleagues or peers who may not have been available. And we hope you enjoy all the other presentations and discussions we have planned for the rest of the month. Other Strat Talks at IFSEC Connect will involve the future of access control, which takes place tomorrow afternoon, and the future of intruder alarms and detection taking place on Thursday. Later in the month, we'll also be looking at protecting cities and public places. Plus, there's loads of exclusive product demos going on, as well as content from co-located shows such as FireX, Safety and Health Expo, Facilities, Intelligent Buildings Europe, and Workplace Wellbeing. I'd also like to encourage everyone to use the platform as much as you have time for over the coming month. We do hope it provides you with the first chance in a long time to connect with new suppliers and industry peers, or just simply reconnect with those you've had long-standing relationships with already. All the meetings take place directly in the platform, so it's well worth keeping the tab open in your browser throughout June. But that's all for now. Thank you so much to everyone. Thank you to our speakers, and have a great day.
Thank you, James.
Hey, James.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you.